Peppa Pig, the Forgotten Friend, and Labubu. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, Peppa and Lucy. Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Labubu, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Labubu was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Labubu sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Labubu. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Labubu, knew where Peppa had gone.
A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, but instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be.
It was very early in the morning when Peppa first heard it. She was sleeping peacefully in her bed when a soft, rhythmic knocking came from her bedroom door. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard a voice, monotone and strange, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Tun, tun, tun, sahur." Peppa sat up in her bed, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Who's there?" she called out, but the knocking continued. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," came the voice again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of her fear, and Peppa slowly approached the door. When she opened it, she gasped. Standing in the hallway was a strange yellow creature with large round eyes and a wooden stick in its hand. The creature looked at Peppa with those unblinking eyes and said just one word, "Sahur." Before Peppa could ask any questions, the creature turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Peppa closed the door quickly, her heart pounding, but sleep would not come again that night. The next morning at breakfast, Peppa tried to tell her family about the strange visitor. "Mummy, Daddy, someone came to my room this morning. They were knocking and saying tun 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 sahur," she explained excitedly. Daddy Pig just laughed. "Peppa, you must have been dreaming. Sahur is just a morning meal that some people have. Your imagination is getting the better of you." Mummy Pig nodded in agreement. "Yes, dear, don't make up scary stories. Now eat your breakfast." But just as they were talking, a rhythmic tapping sound came from outside the house. "Tap! Tap! Tap!" Peppa jumped up from her chair. "Do you hear that?" "That's him!" she cried. The family listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Later that day, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when the yellow creature appeared again. It emerged from behind the bushes, still carrying its wooden stick, and began walking slowly around their yard. "Tun, tun, tun," it said monotonously, tapping the stick against the ground with each word. George hid behind Peppa, frightened by the strange visitor. Peppa, though scared, tried to be brave. "What do you want?" she asked. The creature stopped and looked at her. It held out its stick, offering it to Peppa. "Sahur," it said simply. Peppa didn't take the stick. She watched as the creature continued its slow walk around the garden, tapping and chanting its mysterious phrase. That night, Peppa had terrible nightmares. She dreamed she was trapped in a dark room, surrounded by dozens of yellow creatures, all carrying sticks and chanting "Tun Tun Tun Sahur" in perfect unison. When she woke up in a cold sweat, she looked out her window and saw the creature standing in the garden, staring up at her room. Days passed, and something strange began happening to Peppa's family. They became quiet and listless. Every morning they would sit at the breakfast table in complete silence, eating their food without speaking, then drift apart to their rooms like sleepwalkers. One morning, Peppa watched in horror as Daddy Pig picked up a wooden spoon and began tapping it against the table. "Tun, tun, tun," he said in the same monotone voice as the creature. Soon, Mummy Pig joined in, and then George, all of them tapping and chanting together. The final morning came when Peppa ran outside, desperate to escape the strange behavior of her family. But what she saw in the garden made her blood run cold. The entire yard was filled with yellow creatures, all holding wooden sticks. In the center stood her family, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and little George, each holding a stick of their own. They all turned to look at Peppa with blank, emotionless eyes. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," they chanted in unison, their voices blending with those of the creatures around them. One of the yellow beings approached Peppa and held out a wooden stick. Peppa looked at her transformed family, then at the stick being offered to her. She realized there was no escape, no way back to the life she once knew. Slowly, with trembling hands, Peppa reached out and took the stick. "Sahur," she whispered, her voice already beginning to match the monotone of the others. And so Peppa joined her new family, walking slowly around the garden with the yellow creatures, tapping her stick and chanting the endless phrase that had consumed them all. The morning ritual had claimed another victim, and somewhere in the distance the sound of "Tun Tun Tun Sahur" continued to echo, waiting for the next family to find. Spring in the pig family's house began with cleaning. Mummy Pig was washing the windows, Daddy Pig was vacuuming, and Peppa and George were dusting their toys. Everything was cheerful, until suddenly, from below, a strange sound echoed from the basement. It was a dull, scraping noise, like something heavy slowly rolling across the floor. "Daddy, did you hear that?" asked Peppa. Daddy Pig didn't respond, too busy tidying up. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a long rustling. Curiosity took over, and Peppa pulled George by the hand. "Let's go see." Maybe something just fell. They opened the basement door. A wave of damp, dusty air rushed out. The stairs creaked under each step. and the lower they went, the colder it became. In the farthest corner, among old boxes, lay a round object that looked like a tire. It was covered in dust, but beneath the grime, faint wet spots glistened, as if alive. "What's that?" asked George. Peppa stepped closer. Something flickered in the center of the tire. She gasped. It was an eye, large, still, and cloudy, like a frog's. It blinked. The tire shuddered, turned slightly, and Peppa saw that underneath it were human legs, thin and grey, while from the top, emerging out of the shadows, was a frog-like head with a wide mouth and damp, rubbery skin. The creature stood motionless, staring straight at them. George clutched Peppa's hand. "Peppa, what is that?" It didn't move. Only a faint rhythmic whisper came from deep within the basement, as if someone were chanting meaningless words. "Umbalaboo, umbalaboo." Peppa stepped back. "We have to go." But the staircase behind them was gone. In its place hung a thick grey mist. The air grew heavy, almost sticky. A thin vapor rose from the tire, spreading around them. The world began to tremble. The floor disappeared beneath their feet, and the walls melted away, turning into clouds of fog. When the trembling stopped, they were no longer at home. Peppa and George stood in an empty space with no ceiling or floor. Glowing shadows floated slowly in the air, as if the objects themselves had come to life. Toys, shelves, furniture, everything drifted weightlessly, like in a dream. And in the middle of that strange void, it appeared again. Boneka Ambalabu. Now it was moving, slowly rolling forward like a living tire, leaving behind a wet trail. Its human legs walked on nothing, and its eyeless gaze gleamed faintly through the fog. The creature tilted its head, and from its mouth came a quiet, drawn-out rasping sound. It was like a melody, the warped tune of an old music box, stretched beyond recognition. "I want to go home," whispered George. Peppa looked around. On the ground beside them stood the same music box that started it all. It trembled slightly, as if calling them. "Wind it up," said Peppa. George turned the handle. The melody played again, uneven, distorted. The creature twitched, stretched upward, and its outline began to fade into the mist. The world around them glowed with a pale, ghostly light. For a moment, it felt like they were returning. The air thickened, familiar. Through the mist, the shapes of boxes and shelves emerged once more. But when Peppa opened her eyes, they weren't home. The room looked almost the same, but colder, dimmer. Everything seemed drained of color. "Mummy? Daddy?" called Peppa. No answer, only the echo of her voice, repeating again and again, softer each time. On the floor sat the music box. It was closed. Peppa approached and touched it. From inside came the same whisper. "Ambalaboo." She slowly stepped back, holding George's hand. The whisper repeated. Now it came from behind them. They turned. In the shadow of the stairs stood Boneka Ambalabu, still, silent. Only its eyes reflected the faint light, as if waiting for the melody to start again. The other window and Labubu Peppa's room had always had one window. Through it, she could see their cozy yard with swings and a bright flower bed. But one morning, Peppa woke up feeling an unusual chill. On the opposite wall appeared a second window, old, with a cracked dark frame and murky glass covered with strange streaks. Beyond the window stretched not their yard, but a grim forest. Tall grey trees without leaves reached toward a pale sky. Fog crept between the trunks, forming eerie shapes. And there, deep in the forest, something was moving. A dark figure slowly moved between the trees. "This can't be real," Peppa whispered, stepping back from the window. She looked through her usual window. George was playing in the yard with his dinosaur. Everything was normal. But when she turned back to the second window, the figure had come closer. "Mummy!" Peppa screamed. "What happened, dear?" asked Mummy Pig, hurrying into the room. "There's a window, a second window, and a forest, and someone's walking there." Mummy looked where Peppa was pointing, but saw only a pink wall with children's drawings. "That's just a wall, dear. You had a very vivid dream. Would you like some warm milk?" "No, Mummy, I'm not sleeping. Look carefully. Everything's fine, darling. Sometimes our imagination plays tricks on us." Mummy kissed Peppa and left. But the window remained. All day, Peppa tried to forget about it, played with George, drew pictures, but by evening, the window had moved lower, almost to her eye level. The fog in the forest became thicker, and the figure approached so close that she could distinguish its long, thin limbs. At night, Peppa woke up to quiet, rhythmic tapping on glass. The window glowed with strange, pale light. Behind the glass, right at the window, stood a figure. Now Peppa could see it clearly. It was a creature similar to herself, but distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Pale, almost transparent face, two big dark eyes, a thin, unnaturally wide smile. "Peppa, you can see me," said the figure with a voice that sounded like distant echo. "Who are you?" Peppa whispered, trembling with fear. "I am Labubu. I have always been here, in this forest, waiting for you. You opened the window between our worlds, Peppa. Now I can come to you. I didn't open any window. Go away. But you looked through the window. You saw me. And now I'm here. Soon I won't just be behind the glass, Peppa. Soon I'll be next to you." Labubu laughed with quiet, ringing laughter. Peppa screamed and ran to the door. Mummy Pig burst into the room, turning on the light. When bright light flooded the room, the second window was gone. "Peppa, what happened? She was there. Labubu, she was talking to me. You had a nightmare, dear. No one is here." But Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. The next morning, the window appeared again, but on a different wall. Peppa began leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you? What do you want?" But in the morning, the notes disappeared, and words appeared scratched on the glass from inside. "I want to be real, like you. Soon I will come out." One night, something terrible happened. The window opened for real. Cold air from Labubu's forest rushed into the room, bringing the smell of old leaves and something dead. A long, pale hand slowly extended from the window. "Peppa, I'm almost here, almost with you," Labubu whispered. "No, please, no," Peppa screamed. "Mummy! Daddy! Help!" Labubu quickly disappeared into the window. Parents came running. She tried to come in. "Labubu tried to come into my room," Peppa cried. "We need to see a doctor," Mummy said to Daddy. But the window continued to appear every night. Each time it opened a little wider. Labubu became more insistent. "Don't be afraid of me, Peppa. I don't want to hurt you. I just want to be your friend. Forever," she said with a soft voice. "You're not real. You can't be my friend," Peppa replied. "But I will become real. Very soon, and then we will never part." And the window remains. Every night it opens wider. Every night Labubu comes closer to fully crossing into Peppa's world, and Peppa can only wait and hope that someone will believe her before it's too late. Because some doors, once opened, never close again, and some friends stay with us forever, whether we want them to or not. The morning at the Pig family's house began as usual. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, and George was playing with his toy dinosaur. Peppa laughed as she colored her drawings with bright crayons. On one of the sheets, she drew herself with a big red circle on her nose and a wide smile. "Look, George! It's me, a clown. Funny Peppa." George giggled, but when Peppa hung the picture on the wall, she thought for a moment that the smile on it had become wider than she had drawn. That evening, when Daddy Pig turned off the television, Peppa noticed a strange reflection in the glass. In the place where she stood, the reflection seemed to smile a little wider. Her eyes looked larger and her mouth stretched upward, as if someone had pulled it by invisible strings. "Maybe I'm just tired," Peppa mumbled and went to bed. That night she woke up to the sound of quiet laughter. It was muffled, coming from somewhere below the floor. Peppa looked around. Everyone was asleep. Only a faint light glowed from the hallway. When she stepped out of her room, she saw herself. Her own reflection in the mirror by the stairs, but not quite. The reflection had a painted clown smile and dark circles around the eyes, like smeared makeup. Peppa stepped closer, and the reflection blinked first. She stumbled back and ran to her bed, hiding under the blanket. She didn't open her eyes until morning. The next day, Mummy Pig noticed Peppa acting strangely. She barely spoke and kept staring at the mirror in the living room. When Mummy asked if something was wrong, Peppa only said, "I don't feel like myself." That evening, while washing up before bed, Peppa looked at her reflection again. Her cheeks seemed brighter than usual, as if someone had drawn red circles on them. And when she smiled, her mouth didn't stop stretching. The skin around her lips strained, but the smile kept growing wider and wider until it was too wide. She slammed the faucet shut and ran to her room. That night, George woke to a quiet humming. A faint light was coming from under the door. He got up and peeked into the hallway. Peppa was standing in front of the mirror. She slowly swayed her head side to side, whispering rhythmic words. Her reflection moved slightly faster than she did. There were dark streaks on her face, like melted makeup. Her smile was wider than a face should allow. George softly called her name, but she didn't respond. She just turned her head toward him, and her grin twitched to the side, as if pulled by invisible strings. The next morning, Peppa seemed unnervingly calm. She barely blinked and quietly hummed the same tune George had heard in the night. Mummy thought she might be sick, but when she looked closer, she noticed red stains on Peppa's cheeks and a faint line of paint at the edge of her lips. "Peppa, have you been playing with makeup?" "No, Mummy," Peppa said, staring straight into her eyes. "It's not paint." That night, the lights in the house went out. Daddy Pig grabbed a flashlight and walked into the hallway. He froze. Long, smeared streaks covered the walls, like someone had dragged their hands through wet red paint. At the end of the hallway stood Peppa. In the dim light, her face looked white as chalk, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Peppa," Daddy called. She stepped forward. The beam of the flashlight caught her eyes. They were empty, without pupils. The smile didn't fade. As Daddy took a step back, Peppa slowly raised her hoof and drew it across her cheek, leaving a red line, as if completing her own mouth. "Peppa, stop!" shouted Mummy Pig, but the little girl was already gone, swallowed by the dark. The next morning, everything looked normal. The house was clean. The walls were white again. Only on the mirror in the living room, someone had drawn 2 red circles and a wide, stretched smile. George stood staring at it. In the reflection beside him, Peppa appeared. He turned around. The room was empty, but the reflection was still smiling. Now, with the face paint of a clown. Night fell over Peppa Pig's house. It all began ordinarily, dinner, casual conversation, but something hung in the air. Peppa felt her parents were acting differently. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig sat at the table too quietly. Their eyes reflected the light of the lamp, but inside, there was nothing. Like 2 glass orbs. No emotions, no warmth. Peppa pushed her plate away, a lump stuck in her throat. George, usually restless, sat silently, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The silence at the table was so heavy that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes. Later, deep in the night, Peppa woke to a strange sound. Something rustled dully in the corridor. She woke George, and together, they cautiously left their room. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker of a lamp from the living room. They came closer and peeked through the crack in the door and froze. Mummy and Daddy Pig stood in the middle of the room, motionless, like statues. Their bodies swayed slightly, as if held by invisible strings. Their eyes were completely black, without a glimmer, and their smiles stretched from ear to ear. "Go back to bed," came Daddy Pig's voice. But it sounded hollow, like an echo in a cave. It was his voice, and at the same time, not his. The children stumbled back and ran to their room. Peppa hid under the blanket and couldn't sleep for a long time. It seemed like the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. The morning only made things worse. At breakfast, Daddy Pig smiled too wide, showing sharp teeth that had never been there before. Mummy moved around the kitchen with unnerving grace, her steps too smooth, too perfect, like a rehearsal of a dance. Peppa glanced at George, but he only shook his head. He was scared. At that moment, something shifted outside the window. First, a shadow, enormous, covering half the yard. Then a heavy step that made the dishes on the table rattle. And then Peppa saw him, Bombardiro Crocodilo, but not the one she once knew. His eyes glowed scarlet, his jaws slightly open, and every tooth shone like a blade. His massive body moved slowly, but each step echoed deep through the ground. He drew closer to the house, and with every lash of his tail, the walls trembled. Peppa shrank back from the window in horror. Mummy and Daddy didn't react. They continued their movements, as if programmed. Suddenly, a voice rang out. Not from her parents, not from outside. It sounded directly inside Peppa's head, low and crushing. "You're watching this! Press the hype button below the video before it's too late." Peppa gasped in terror. It felt like those words weren't meant only for her, as if Bombardiro Crocodilo himself was speaking to someone else, watching alongside her. She grabbed George's hand, and they ran into the corridor. But it was darker than usual. Doors that had never existed appeared along the walls. From each came whispers and rasping breaths. Bulbs flickered and went out one by one. From the living room came a scraping sound. The children froze. Suddenly, Mummy Pig stepped into the corridor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her smile was far too wide, her eyes completely empty. Behind her appeared Daddy. They walked in sync, without hesitation. "Children must obey," they said together in one voice. Peppa and George rushed to the front door, but Bombardiro's silhouette was already outside the glass. His shadow blocked out all the light. His breathing rumbled like a volcano. He tilted his head, and his scarlet eyes blazed even brighter. "We are waiting!" his voice thundered. The door swung open on its own, and a cold wind swept inside. But it wasn't the wind. It was the breath of the crocodilo. It dragged darkness behind it, filling the entire corridor. Peppa screamed, but the sound drowned in the roar. George cowered behind her, his hands shaking. Mummy and Daddy stepped closer, their bodies distorted, merging with the shadows. They no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Bombardiro raised his claw and struck the ground. The house shuddered. Windows cracked. The chandelier swayed. He took another step forward, and at that moment, everything around began to warp. Rooms vanished, walls stretched and collapsed, turning into an endless corridor. Peppa clutched her brother and shut her eyes. But even through her eyelids, she saw the red glow of his eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of a broken melody, like the beat of a heart, and a deep, triumphant growl. "Now you are mine." And the night swallowed everything.